Hello, my name is Jocie Fire, and I'm a boundaries coach. And I'd like to talk to you today about Agatha Christie and the 11 days she went missing. So, Agatha Christie is Guinness Book World Record, best-selling detective mystery author. She sold 2 million books, and that's so for reference. J.K. Rowling, all the Harry Potter's books have sold 600 million, so more than 3 times as many as all the Harry Potter series. Agatha Christie was very humble, down to earth. She had a good sense of humor. When she was a little kid, she would make up stories about all of her imaginary friends. So, one of her favorite games was when her sister would pretend that there was someone that looked just like her but wasn't her. And she would go out and come back in and be like, "Oh, I'm your sister." And it would creep Agatha out a lot, and her mom would say, "Stop it, stop it." And her sister would say, "Agatha's the one that's asking me to play this game with her." And another favorite story I have from her childhood is when she almost drowned. And I think it illustrates her pretty chill sense of humor, is that she was mainly upset because people had told her that if you almost died, your life would flash before your eyes and you would hear music. And she was like, all I could think about was getting my next breath. So it was very disappointing. She said she never really got used to being famous. She felt like she was pretending to be famous. She was like, here is Agatha going down the stairs, pretending to be a famous author. And so her family was upper middle class in England at that time. So they had a few servants, but they didn't have any horses or carriages, and they had some money for traveling. But all of that came from her grandfather's business, money that had been invested from that. And her father just lived off of that and put it in the hands of other people to manage, and they did not manage it very well. And they got the news when she was about 13 that there had been major financial losses. It sounded like the investments had been put into not good real estate, had not been managed well. And the father was trying to figure out what to do. He had no way of getting income. He had just lived as a dude that would go to his clubs. And so he was a nice dad, he was a nice husband, but he didn't plan ahead very well. And he ended up having a heart attack at this time. And her mother was devastated, and they all were devastated. Um, and a few years after this, her sister got married, and Agatha and her mom basically were hanging out together the whole time. They were very good friends. Her mother was a good listener to her. Um, Her mother is the one that encouraged her to start writing. She said, "Remember when you'd write stories when you were little? And why don't you try that again?" And Agatha said it was kind of just like her version of being creative. Her version of embroidery was writing. And she didn't really think she could make money with it, but she figured she might as well try. Agatha said she was proposed to a lot.
Will you marry me?
She kind of made a joke about it. She didn't know if that was just the thing at the time, but she had received several proposals, and she was actually already engaged to someone else at the time that she met her husband. Now that somebody else had said, if you meet somebody else you would like to get married, don't worry about it. We can call it off. But he said that because he was poor and he didn't want her to feel tied down. So he was disappointed when she got engaged to her husband because he was poor too. So she met her husband in 1912. He was at one of the parties she was going to, and he began to show up a lot. And at one of the parties, she was like, "What is wrong with him? He's not answering any of my questions. He looks like he's feeling sick." And she says, "I was rather stupid, really. I should have known by now that when a man looks like a sick sheep, completely bemused, stupid, and unable to listen to what you have to say to him, he has, vulgarly, got it badly." I feel like the way he proposed is indicative of his character. He said, "You've got to marry me. You've got to. I've had an awful time getting your address and finding you. Nothing could have been more difficult. There will never be anyone but you. You've got to marry me." And she told him, "I'm already engaged." And he said, "What on earth does that matter? You'll just have to break it off, that's all." And she said, I can't possibly do that." And he said, "Of course you could. I'm not engaged to anyone else, but if I was, I'd break it off in a minute without even thinking about it." So they were in World War One, and her husband was actually one of the very first pilots, in the first 200 pilots for the British. And they decided not to get married at this time and to put it off until after the war. But suddenly he decided over a Christmas visit, he said, "We're getting married right now." And she said, "Your mom is not going to be very happy with that if we get married," I think he said, "tomorrow or 2 days from now." And he said, "Who cares? Who cares if she's distressed?" And so his mom just sat in her room and cried. And Agatha was like, "Okay." And she just went along with it, and they tried to make it work, and they finally were able to get a license and get married. After the war, they were able to go and travel. He was able to take her on a work trip. They were actually some of the first two British stand-up surfers in Hawaii, and she had a fantastic time. She always loved swimming, and she said that was one of the most fantastic feelings, was learning how to surf. And they just had a lot of fun together. They had a daughter, Rosalind, and Agatha began to write more seriously because their finances weren't great, and she also just enjoyed it as a way of keeping herself busy. And her husband, things were hard, and then things got better. He got a better job, and he also became super enamored with golf. So there were hard times, there were good times. In my opinion, Agatha seemed quite fair to him. And this is what she says: "Did I realize that there might be something not quite right in the even tenor of our days? I don't think so. And yet there was a certain lack, though I don't ever think I put it into definite terms to myself. I missed the early companionship of our time together, Archie and I. I missed the weekends when we had gone by bus or by train and had explored places. Our weekends now were the dullest time for me. And so he had wanted to move to a suburb that had a lot of golf in the area, and he had become obsessed with golf. And she said even he was taking the game so seriously now that it might have been a religion. And so she was very Victorian. She was doing things his way. She wanted another baby. He said no. He wanted her to use some of her money to buy cars. They bought 2 cars. They bought a more expensive house. And she just was fairly happy to get along with it, except for that he told her to not invite friends over because, unless they were just single ladies, because if it was a guy, then he would have to skip his golf game and hang around to keep the guy happy. And so most of her friends were married, so that was pretty difficult on her. She said the weekends were the most dullest thing ever. Thanks to her husband. Of the year 1926, she says, the next year of my life is one I hate recalling. And so in April, her mother had been sick of bronchitis, and her sister said, hey, come and visit, but neither of them thought it was very serious. But when she was traveling on the train, she suddenly felt cold, and she just thought, my mother has died. And she was correct. And this was very difficult for her to deal with. And when her husband, he was in Spain at the time, for work, and when he came back, he said, oh, hello, kind of like, let's cheer up now. And he said, why don't you come back to Spain with me so it can distract you? He wasn't okay with her being sad. He'd always said, I'm not one for illness. I'm not one for people having a hard time. Let's just cheer up and get over it. And she said, I don't want to be distracted. And she says, I didn't want to be distracted. I wanted to be with my sorrow and learn to get used to it. So I thanked him and said I'd rather stay home. I see now that I was wrong. My life with Archie lay ahead of me. We were happy together, assured of each other, and neither of us would have dreamed that we could ever part. But he hated the feeling of sorrow in the house, and it left him open to other influences. So they decided that they were going to rent out their house, their big fancy house, and so that would alleviate some of their financial struggles, and he would rent an apartment in London, and she would stay at her childhood home, cleaning out all of her mom's and grandma's stuff that had accumulated over the years, and repair the house. And she says, I suppose I was already run down and slightly ill, but turning out that house with the memories, the hard work, the sleepless nights, reduced me to such a nervous state that I hardly knew what I was doing. And it was compounded with her grandma had a fear of robbers and would hide things randomly. So even in a stack of something that looked innocuous, a pile of papers would have like an envelope with a bunch of money in it. A sock, she found a diamond brooch wrapped up in a sock. So she had to go through every single thing, she felt like, to make sure she wasn't throwing away something important. She asked her husband if he could come down for the weekend. She couldn't leave because their babysitter, their nanny, her dad had gotten sick. So she was out of town. And so she asked Archie, can he come down for a weekend? And he said that would be a foolish thing to do and a waste of time because he'd only be able to be there for a Saturday. And she thought, well, it's really probably because he doesn't want to miss a golf game. And she's like, that wasn't very nice of me to think that. But it was worse than that. So she started to notice she was breaking down, even though at the time she said she didn't really realize it as after the fact that one time she went to write her name and she couldn't remember who she was. She tried to start her car once and it wouldn't start, and she just went in the house and cried. And, that might be something I would do normally, but apparently that's not something that she normally would do, is just cry over a car not starting. And so in August, so she'd been working on this for a couple of months. In August, Archie finally came to visit, and they were supposed to leave and go to Italy, and her sister was coming to watch Rosalind. And she said when her sister, who she called Punky, came, she said she was so happy. And then when Archie came, everything was wrong. And she said it was like the nightmare from her childhood of it's someone that you know, but it's not really them. And he was acting completely different. And even her sister was like, what's wrong with him? And she was like, I'm not sure. And she kept saying, when are we leaving for Italy? And he was like, it's all settled. I'll talk to you about it. And he finally let her know, well, I didn't buy the tickets. And she said, oh, okay. It's like, you want to stay and play with our daughter. Like, I think that's a really good idea. And he was like, no, that's not what's going on. Well, she said it took him maybe a day to finally tell her, actually, this girl that used to be my boss's secretary, do you remember her? And she's like, oh, yeah. He's like, well, I've been hanging out with her a lot. And she's like, okay. He's like, you don't understand. And he said, I've fallen in love with her and I want a divorce. And she said, and with those words, my happy life ended. So she says, and with that, my happy life ended, but not right away because I refused to realize it. And he left for a couple of weeks, and then he came back, and I think he was trying to work it out for their daughter, but she said that was one of the hardest things was that he was very vicious to her emotionally at that time. He wouldn't talk to her. If she asked him a question, he wouldn't answer her. Um, and she said friends at this time are useless. All her friends would say, oh, he's just, he'll get over it. Just be patient. And to quote Archie, he said, I can't stand not having what I want, and I can't stand not being happy. Everybody can't be happy. Somebody has got to be unhappy. And she said she thought, well, why should it be me and not you? But she felt like saying that, but she didn't. And so in December 3rd, this is the whole drama situation. He wanted to go down to London and to be with his friends, and he did not want her going with him. And I'm assuming that this is when she realized this is not going to work out. He's going to continue on with this mistress, and I'm actually going to get a divorce. And so she didn't put this in her autobiography or any of her public notes. It's in the book by Lucy Worsley, and I believe it's from private papers. And so let me read that for you. All that night I drove aimlessly about. In my mind there was the vague idea of ending everything. I drove automatically down roads I knew, to Maidenhead where I looked at the river. I thought about jumping in, but realized that I could swim too well to drown. Then back to London again, and then on to Sunningdale. From there I went to Newlands Corner. And when I reached a point in the road which I thought was near the quarry I had seen in the afternoon, I turned the car off the road down the hill towards it. I left the wheel and let the car run. The car struck something with a jerk and pulled up suddenly. I was flung against the steering wheel, and my head hit something. So her car was found without her in it, and with her clothes, I guess she had a packed suitcase in the car. And the press just went crazy over this. A reward was offered. 1,000 police officers, 15,000 volunteers, a couple of airplanes. The ponds were dredged, the whole thing. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle took one of her gloves and gave it to a medium to see if they could find answers that way. As time went on, Archie was more embarrassed about what was happening and trying to deflect from the actual situation. He said, well, she's always said she could go missing if she wanted to. And so this probably just has to do with her writing murder mysteries and something that she planned out. And he also said, we did not fight. That's untrue. Stop spreading such tittle-tattle. And so he's the one that introduced the idea that she possibly ran away on purpose. So 11 days later, she was found at a spa and like a hotel that was like a hotel spa. And 2 doctors verified that she had amnesia. And she said she became Tress Neal from South Africa. And she wasn't hiding from anyone. She actually went to London and took a train. And she said she was surprised that the conductors didn't, like she had dirt and blood on her, that she was surprised that they didn't notice something was wrong. And then she took a ticket to the spa hotel. She even went shopping and ordered clothes and things. And she read the newspapers. She said, I remember reading about this Mrs. Christie and in the newspaper and thinking, she's being very foolish. And she says after this whole situation, like she became more of a jaded and less trusting person, even though that doesn't really come across in her writings. I think just more before that, she assumed that everybody had good intentions and wouldn't, go and purposely harm other people just to get their own way. And so for practical application, life tips from a boundary coach, I would say always, and this is what Agatha Christie would say as well. She says in her book, always take care of yourself. If you notice that you're crying for no reason or that you're starting to forget things, even if you haven't ever had emotional issues or mental issues before, like slow down and get some help. The second takeaway I would say is believe what other people show you. Her husband had shown all along that he was a ruthless, and that's her mother's wording, he's a ruthless person and self-involved, but she had never seen the other side of that coin until she got in his way of happiness. She'd always been on his side of happiness. Takeaway number 3, I would say, is it's never your fault when someone cheats. And I know we should know this, but it's the tendency to feel, and especially back in Agatha Christie's time, she felt like it was her fault and she could have done better and then their family would have been preserved. But I think he was a jerk and she was better off without him. But so it's never your fault if somebody cheats. If this is what adults do, if you have a problem with your spouse, you need to be honest and bring it up and give them a chance to work on it sincerely. The 4th takeaway I would say is your future can be fantastic, no matter how hard things are now. Agatha, after this experience, she went traveling by herself, which she had never done before, and she was totally terrified, but she said, this is what my life is now and I need to do it. and she had a great time and met new people and saw all kinds of interesting things in the Middle East. And she met her second husband, Max Malawan, and they stayed married for 46 years until she died. And she was a famous author and all those good things. So no matter what awful things are happening to you now, you always have the potential for a bright future. Start taking care of yourself and put in boundaries. Get those dumpster fire Archies out of your life. Thank you for listening.